On July 13th, 2025, a man walked into a space where people felt safe, where they believed the worst thing that could happen was an argument or a bad day at work, and he methodically ended 3 lives, including his own. The target was not random. It was the mother of his children, the woman who once shared his bed, his dreams, his future. And in the final moments of his life, Guy E. House decided that if he could not have control over her, no one would. Before we begin, make sure you subscribe so you never miss stories like this. This is not a story about a monster. This is a story about a man who became one. And the terrifying truth is that the transformation happened slowly, invisibly, into quiet spaces between arguments, custody battles, and sleepless nights. By the time anyone realized what was happening, it was already too late. Guy E. House was not born a killer. He was born into a world that promised him something. A world that told him if he worked hard, if he loved deeply, if he built a family, he would find meaning. And for a time he did. He had children. He had a partner. He had a life that looked, from the outside, like it was supposed to look. But somewhere along the way, the foundation cracked. And when it did, everything he had built began to collapse inward. The details of his relationship with the mother of his children remained partially obscured, protected by the privacy of family courts and the silence of those who knew them. But what we do know is this: their relationship ended. And for Guy, that ending was not just the loss of a partner. It was the loss of identity, control, and purpose. In his mind, she had taken everything from him: his children, his home, his future. And in the months leading up to July 13th, that belief hardened into something cold and unshakable. Would you have seen the warning signs? Would you have known that the man sitting across from you at a mediation hearing, the man who seemed angry but not dangerous, was already planning something unthinkable? Grievance-driven violence does not announce itself with fanfare. It builds in silence. It festers in the mind of someone who believes they have been wronged beyond repair, someone who has convinced themselves that the world has conspired against them. And Guy E. House was drowning in that belief. Every court date, every custody arrangement, every interaction with his ex-partner became another piece of evidence in the case he was building against her. A case that would never see a courtroom. A case that would only be resolved with bullets. The psychology of spree killings is distinct from other forms of violence. Unlike serial killers, who operate over extended periods with careful planning and ritualistic behavior, spree killers act in a compressed time frame driven by a singular, overwhelming emotional state. They are not hunting for pleasure. They are executing a mission. And that mission is almost always rooted in a perceived injustice. Guy E. House believed he had been wronged. He believed that the mother of his children had destroyed his life. And in his mind, the only way to restore balance, to reclaim some semblance of control, was to destroy hers. But here's where the psychology becomes even more disturbing. Spree killers often do not see themselves as villains. They see themselves as victims. They see themselves as people who have been pushed too far, who have been left with no other choice. And in that twisted logic, violence becomes not an act of evil, but an act of justice. Do you think Guy E. House believed he was doing the right thing? Do you think in the final moments before he pulled the trigger, he felt justified? The answer is almost certainly yes, because that is how the mind protects itself from the horror of its own actions. It constructs a narrative. It builds a story in which the violence is not senseless but necessary. And once that story is in place, once the mind has accepted it as truth, there is no turning back. On the morning of July 13th, 2025, Guy E. House woke up knowing what he was going to do. He had likely been planning it for days, maybe weeks. He had thought through the logistics, the timing, the location. He had imagined the moment over and over again in his mind, rehearsing it until it felt inevitable. And then he acted. The shootings took place in Lexington, Kentucky, a city that had seen its share of violence, but nothing quite like this. The details of the attack are chilling in their precision. Guy did not fire wildly. He did not lose control. He moved with purpose, targeting the mother of his children with a focus that suggests this was not a crime of passion, but a crime of calculation. 2 other people were killed. Their identities, their stories, their reasons for being in that place at that time, all of it was erased in seconds. They were not his targets. They were collateral. They were in the wrong place at the wrong time, caught in the blast radius of one man's rage. And then, when it was over, when he had done what he came to do, Guy E. House turned the gun on himself. This is the final act of many spree killers. Suicide is not an escape. It is the conclusion of the narrative they have constructed. They do not want to face the consequences of their actions. They do not want to be judged, to be imprisoned, to be remembered as a monster, so they end it on their own terms. They take control one last time. But what they leave behind is not closure, it is chaos. It is trauma. It is a community trying to make sense of something that will never make sense. The aftermath of a spree killing is a landscape of unanswered questions. Why did he do it? Could it have been prevented? Were there warning signs that were missed? And the most haunting question of all, could this happen again? In the case of Guy E. House, the answers are both simple and impossibly complex. He did it because he believed he had no other choice. He did it because his sense of self had become so entangled with his grievances that he could no longer separate the two. He did it because, in his mind, the only way to end his pain was to inflict it on others. Could it have been prevented? Maybe, if someone had recognized the depth of his despair. If someone had intervened before his thoughts turned to violence. If the systems designed to protect people in domestic disputes had been more effective. But the truth is, we will never know. Because the signs of impending violence are often only clear in hindsight. Would you have known? If you had been his friend, his coworker, his family member, would you have seen it coming? The reality is that most people who knew Guy E. House probably did not. Because people like him do not always look dangerous. They look hurt. They look angry. They look like someone going through a hard time. And in a world where everyone is struggling with something, it is easy to miss the moment when struggle turns into something darker. Domestic instability is one of the most reliable predictors of violence. When relationships break down, when families fracture, when people lose the structures that give their lives meaning, the risk of violence increases exponentially. And in cases where children are involved, where custody battles and parental rights become battlegrounds, that risk becomes even greater. Guy E. House was not just angry at his ex-partner. He was angry at a system he believed had failed him. He was angry at a world that had taken his children away from him. And that anger, left unchecked, metastasized into something lethal. But here is the uncomfortable truth. Anger alone does not create killers. Millions of people go through divorces, custody battles, and personal traumas without ever picking up a weapon. So what makes someone cross that line? What transforms grief and rage into violence? The answer lies in the intersection of personality, circumstance, and opportunity. Some people are more prone to externalizing their pain, to blaming others for their suffering. Some people have access to weapons and the knowledge of how to use them. And some people reach a point where they no longer care about the consequences. Guy E. House reached that point. And when he did, 3 people died. The concept of emotionally destructive obsession is central to understanding this case. Guy E. House did not simply move on from his relationship. He could not. His ex-partner had become the focal point of his entire emotional world. Every thought, every feeling, every moment of his day was filtered through the lens of what she had done to him. This is not love. This is not even hate. This is something more insidious. It is a psychological fixation that consumes everything else. It is the inability to let go, to accept loss, to imagine a future that does not include the object of obsession. And when that obsession is combined with a sense of grievance, when the person believes they have been wronged beyond repair, the result can be catastrophic. Do you think he ever considered another path? Do you think there was a moment, in the days or hours before the shooting, when he could have chosen differently? The answer is probably yes. There is almost always a moment. A moment when the person stands at the edge, when they can still turn back. But in that moment, Guy E. House chose violence. He chose to end lives rather than rebuild his own. The collapse of personal relationships is a universal human experience. We all lose people. We all face rejection, betrayal, and heartbreak. But most of us find a way to survive it. We grieve, we heal, we move forward. We do not pick up a gun and destroy everything in our path. So what was different about Guy E. House? What made him incapable of doing what the rest of us do? The answer is likely a combination of factors. A personality predisposed to externalizing blame. A lack of emotional regulation skills. A history of trauma or instability that made him more vulnerable to collapse. And perhaps most importantly, a belief system that allowed him to justify violence as a solution. Because that is the final piece of the puzzle. People do not commit acts of extreme violence unless they have convinced themselves, on some level, that it is acceptable. They construct a narrative in which they are the hero, or at least the victim, and their targets are the villains. And once that narrative is in place, once they have given themselves permission, the violence becomes inevitable. The community of Lexington was left reeling. 3 people were dead, others were injured. And the question on everyone's mind was the same: how did this happen? In the days and weeks that followed, there were calls for action. Calls for better mental health resources. Calls for stricter gun control. Calls for more effective intervention in domestic disputes. And all of these calls were valid. All of these systems had failed in one way or another to prevent this tragedy. But the uncomfortable truth is that no system can catch everyone. No amount of intervention can eliminate the risk entirely, because violence, at its core, is a human problem. And as long as humans are capable of rage, of obsession, of despair, there will be people who choose to act on those feelings in destructive ways. What we can do is recognize the warning signs. We can take threats seriously. We can support people who are struggling before they reach the point of no return. We can create a culture in which seeking help is not seen as weakness but as strength. But we cannot eliminate the risk entirely. And that is the most terrifying part of all. Guy E. House is dead. The mother of his children is dead. An innocent bystander is dead. And the survivors, the children who lost their parents, the community that lost its sense of safety, are left to pick up the pieces. This is the legacy of spree violence. It is not just the immediate loss of life. It is the ripple effect that spreads outward, touching everyone who was connected to the victims, everyone who witnessed the aftermath, everyone who now has to live with the knowledge that something like this can happen. And the most disturbing part is that it will happen again. Not in the same way, not with the same people, but somewhere, someone else will reach the same breaking point. Someone else will decide that violence is the only answer. Someone else will walk into a space where people feel safe and shatter that safety forever. The case of Guy E. House is not unique. It is part of a pattern of men who lose control of their lives and decide to take control through violence. It is a pattern of domestic disputes that escalate into murder. It is a pattern of grievances that fester until they explode. And until we address the root causes, until we create systems that can identify and intervene before violence occurs, this pattern will continue. But even then, even with the best systems in place, there will always be people who slip through the cracks. There will always be people who hide their intentions until it is too late. There will always be people like Guy E. House who wake up one morning and decide that today is the day. So what do we take away from this? What lesson can we learn from the deaths of 3 people on a summer day in Kentucky? The lesson is this: violence is not random, it is not unpredictable. It is the result of a process that begins long before the first shot is fired. And if we pay attention, if we take the warning signs seriously, if we intervene before it is too late, we can save lives. But we have to be willing to look. We have to be willing to see the pain beneath the anger, the despair beneath the rage. We have to be willing to reach out to people who are struggling, even when it is uncomfortable, even when it is difficult. Because the alternative is more days like July 13th, 2025, more communities shattered, more lives lost, more families destroyed. And that is a price we cannot afford to keep paying. Guy E. House believed he had no other choice. He believed that violence was the only way to end his pain, to reclaim his power, to make the world acknowledge his suffering. He was wrong. But by the time he realized it, if he ever did, it was too late. The bullets had been fired. The lives had been taken. The damage had been done. And now, all that remains is the question: could we have stopped him? The answer is maybe. Maybe if someone had seen the signs, maybe if someone had intervened. Maybe if the systems designed to protect people had worked the way they were supposed to. But maybe is not enough. Maybe does not bring back the dead. Maybe does not heal the trauma. Maybe does not prevent the next Guy E. House from making the same choice. What would you have done? If you had known him, if you had seen the warning signs, would you have acted? Or would you have assumed, like so many others do, that it was not your problem, that someone else would handle it, that it would never actually happen? Because that is the final, most uncomfortable truth of all. We are all responsible. Not for the violence itself, but for the world that allows it to happen. For the culture that tells men they must be strong, that they must be in control, that losing is unacceptable. For the systems that fail to protect victims until it is too late. For the silence that surrounds domestic violence, mental health struggles, and the warning signs of impending tragedy. Guy E. House did not become a killer overnight. He became one slowly, over months or years, as his pain turned to rage and his rage turned to obsession. And somewhere along the way, someone could have stopped him. But no one did. And now, 3 people are dead,